had two motivations for this study. So one is that previous studies have shown that the language that moms use with their kids predicts kids' vocabulary. And vocabulary is a really important skill when kids start kindergarten. It's strongly predictive of later academic outcomes. So our first motivation was to see if we could replicate that finding with the sample. So we have this very big sample. It's over 1,000 kids in rural North Carolina and Pennsylvania. So our first question was whether we found that mom language predicted child vocabulary, and we were also interested to see, so we know that mom's socioeconomic background predicts the quality of the language that they use with their kids. And so mom language is one mechanism through which socioeconomic status affects later child language development. So our first question was whether we could see if that held in this study. If this is one of the biggest studies where that question has been asked. And we found that it did. So we found that socioeconomic status predicts mom's language input, that mom's language input predicts child vocabulary, and then there's an indirect pathway. So mom is one mechanism through which that explains why kids from lower socioeconomic backgrounds have lower vocabulary outcomes. Then our second question, which is our second motivation for the study, was that we know that around kindergarten, child vocabulary and executive function are related to each other. And executive function refers to kind of the set of cognitive processes that are important for kind of higher order thinking. So they underlie a lot of the learning processes that occur, especially in early childhood. So we know that vocab and executive function are related to each other. And so in this study we asked, does mom language input, which we know predicts child language, also predict executive function? So our second aim was to test a very similar model as with child vocabulary, but with executive function as the outcome. So again, we found that socioeconomic status predicts mom language input, and mom language input predicts child executive function. And that there's an indirect pathway. So mom language input is one mechanism through which kids from low socioeconomic status end up with lower executive function abilities. And that's a novel finding in literature. So previously people have focused on things like parenting as a predictor of child executive function, or child executive function, or child characteristics, but no one has looked at parent language as a predictor. And then kind of to add just a little bit more complexity into the model, we were really interested to think about why do moms of lower socioeconomic status use lower quality language with their kids. So previous studies have looked at some child characteristics, so kids who have more difficult temperaments, so who are just more difficult to engage with, their moms tend to use lower quality language, tend to use lower language overall. Some research has also found that moms' knowledge of child development predicts that the more knowledge moms have, the better quality language they use with their kids. But no one has really examined mom mental health as a possible characteristic that explains lower quality language, even though we know that moms who have depression or who have higher depression symptoms engage with their children differently. So they have lower patience, for example, so it's harder for them to maintain the sustained interactions that tend to lead to really high quality language with their kids. So the last question we asked was whether moms depression symptoms was a mechanism that explained why moms from lower socioeconomic status use lower quality language with their kids. And we found that indeed that was the case. It's not a strong effect, so meaning it doesn't explain a lot of that relationship, but it explains a little bit. And it makes sense because we think that moms from lower socioeconomic status are having, harder lives, right? There's a lot of chaos maybe in the home. They have to worry more about how to make ends meet and those kinds of things. So they have more depression. They're more likely to show depression symptoms and in turn use lower quality language with their kids. So that's kind of the broad overview of our findings. So just to give you a little recap for the results. So we replicated previous findings showing that mom language input is one mechanism through which we find why kids of lower socioeconomic status have lower vocab. And we added to the literature by showing that it also is a mechanism why kids from lower socioeconomic status have lower executive function ability. And then we also showed that caregiver depression is one mechanism through which low socioeconomic status may translate into moms using lower quality